Hey, what is up, everyone? Thank you so much for joining our broadcast and panel tonight. We are talking about scrapping the culture fit and evolving to becoming a culture ad organization. My name is Chris Lynn. I am one of the moderators for this panel. I am the host of the Leading People First podcast and the one of the co-founders of the Leaders for Equity, Allyship, and Diversity. I'm also so pleased to be moderating this panel with my good friend and also another co-founder of the lead group, Johnny C. Carlson.
Woo, woo.
What is up, John?
I am so ready for this and so pumped for this conversation.
Yeah, let's go. Well, do you want to share a little bit about yourself before we introduce our panelists?
Yeah, sure. Just a quick intro. My name is John Carlson. I'm the CEO and founder of JD Consults, a DEI transformation consulting firm. I've been in the D&I space for about 7 years, and most recently have launched the #NoBS podcast, where you'll frequently find Chris as a guest co-host. So I'm just grateful to be here. I'm glad we were able to put together this great panel. I do want to let the audience know, just a quick caveat to start, that we did have an additional panelist that you will not see tonight. Barbie Winterbottom, unfortunately, wasn't feeling well, and so she wasn't able to make it. Hopefully, she will be able to make the next one. But with that being said, let's get started.
Let's do it. Yeah, and real quick, if you're joining us live on YouTube, throw your comments up. Let us know what you're thinking. Ask us your questions. Give a quick shout out where you're coming from right now as we're introducing people. So John, take it away.
All right. First up, we have Yvonne Alston. Yvonne is a DEI strategist, communicator, and marketer who launched her firm Indelible Impressions Consulting. What makes Yvonne a unique and strong DEI partner is her 21 years in strategy, delivering the right message, and executing to help organizations achieve their goals. Yvonne strongly believes that being inclusive and creating a culture of belonging brings out the best in individuals, boosts innovation and productivity, increases team cohesion, and ultimately strengthens an organization's workforce and bottom line. So welcome to the stage, Yvonne.
Woo! Hello, everybody.
Hey.
So excited to be here. Paying comments to Chris and John. Awesome. Can't wait.
So excited to have you.
Thank you.
All right. So next on the stage, we have Cheryl Leong. Cheryl is a conscious leadership coach, DEI consultant, and licensed therapist and host of the podcast, Global Citizenship and Equity. So welcome to the stage, Cheryl.
Hi, hello.
Hello. And then finally, we have Vic Marsh. Vic is a management researcher focused on DEI as organizational change. A former U.S. diplomat in China, Haiti, and Cyprus, Vic is here to bring a little more diplomacy to workplaces.
How's it going, everybody?
Hi, Vic.
What is up, Vic? Man, I just want to give a quick shout out to Vic. I've had a very extensive, long conversations with him. I'm so glad that he's here. Yvonne is also a co-founder of LEAD. So again, quick shout out to the Leaders for Equity, Allyship, and Diversity team. If you want to join us, we meet every Thursday night. And Cheryl is a fantastic DEI consultant. So I'm so excited to get started with this panel and talking about culture fit versus culture ad. So let's dive right in. Yvonne, I'll have you start and we'll do a quick roundtable. What is the difference between culture fit and culture ad?
All right. Wow. So as we know, culture fit that has been historic throughout many organizations was really stemmed in like how well teams get along, how the employees embody really the beliefs and the values and the mission of the company, and oftentimes as well the demographic profile of a team. However, culture ad is where we want to go. It seeks people who value an organization standards and culture and brings something different that really positively contributes to the company in a really positive way. So culture ad focuses on the people. who not only value these company standards and workplace culture, but they bring an aspect of diversity that really positively contributes to the organization.
Awesome. Cheryl, what about you? What is the difference that you see between culture fit and culture add?
So I think for me, I use this metaphor a lot. I think of culture fit as kind of that traditional melting pot idea where people come in and you kind of fit into a particular culture. And you kind of, the idea is that people melt down to become something that fits the culture. And traditionally, I think we've thought of organizations as, the culture of the leader is the culture of the organization. And so, I think that what I would like to see a lot of organizations shift to is the culture of a all-you-can-eat buffet, international buffet, where it's all the foods on there. It's not a melting pot. It's not a salad. It's a buffet, and it's all you can eat. And it just allows for valuing just sort of the power of diversity, where there's lots of different dishes on the table, and all of it's good. And yeah, anyway, that's another.
Awesome. Well, let's go to the buffet. I mean, it's dinner time here on the West Coast, so
I'm hungry too. Yeah.
Well, Vic, as the researcher of the group and the academic, what is your definition? How would you differentiate culture fit and culture add?
Sure. I would think of culture fitting in, that sort of thing, as something related to conforming, right? We don't allow very many haircut styles in our armed forces. We're trying to present a single unified culture to represent us in some complex situation, right? So that would be a culture fit. Organizations with a strong culture that think there's something important about it, and they say, you have arrived and you've got to fit into this, right? Culture add, I think, is associated with probably some more complexity, right? We don't know what's coming. The environment is weird. We don't know what's happening out there. So we've got to just keep adding multiple lenses, multiple types of folks here, so that we've got all the basket of knowledge we need to deal with this weird, uncertain kind of future out there, right? So I think of culture add as sort of just preparing for uncertainty. We don't know exactly what's going on, but we know we need a whole lot of different brains here who might shift our culture in a different way than we're used to.
I love that. Yeah. All sorts of different people coming together and having those multiple brains to shift culture. So I want to ask all of you, what have been some negative effects you've seen of going after that culture fit? Yvonne, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think when employers, ascribe to culture fit, they hire more of what already exists within their organization. They're essentially really working against their own best interests. They're selecting against their real opportunities to compete and succeed. It's through the diversity of different people, the value that they bring to an organization that helps them solve problems, innovate, tap into new markets, conceivably even launch a product or service ahead of the competition. But you need that diversity of not just, diversity, as a lot of people like to, pigeonhole it, but diversity of thought, diversity of skills, and understanding that we should want something that we don't already have. That's how you add value, is looking at the landscape and saying, okay, for this particular team, here's what we've got on the bench. Now let's get something else, somebody else who brings a different dimension, somebody who brings some other skills that we don't have, so we can strengthen that bench.
Yeah, absolutely. Vic, what are your thoughts?
Well, my concern when you see homogeneity hires, right? And I saw a great Twitter thread I'll probably put out on LinkedIn about this, saying if we're going to talk about so and so as a diversity hire, then we sure ought to talk about the folks who are homogeneity hires, right? You have departments that are all Mikes, right? There's Mike A, Mike B, Mike C, and you find out they've all got the same alumni network, right? And I think when people are going for culture fit, a lot of times it's because they don't want to be interpreters. You imagine people like us with our headphones on at the United Nations, simultaneously interpreting the words of one person who speaks a different dialect, a different language, into the ears of another human being. That's some of the hardest work out there. And, as a diplomat, I always thanked the interpreters at the end of a long meeting, right? Because they're helping to get the job done. What we have in organizations that focus on culture fit is people are saying, stop, I'm not going to interpret. I'm not going to crosswalk your type of communication to mine, your cultural background to mine, your stack of code that you learned at one tech place to us and how we do things here. Someone is refusing to do some interpretation work. And I think that's an abdication of leadership work. Interpretation work is boss work. You're either going to earn that top dollar for being a boss or you're not. So culture fit, I think, is often a sign that someone is refusing to do some interpretation, some translation to help the group reach its potential.
Wow, yeah, I couldn't have said that better. Thank you. Cheryl, what about you? What are your thoughts?
Some of the negatives I've seen, I think what happens with culture fit is there becomes a covert organizational culture, and then there's an overt organizational culture. And what often happens is we don't talk about the covert culture, but it's happening, right? And so it's unspoken sort of understanding that there's a set of norms in which everybody has to be seen from. There's a particular lens in which everybody has to see each other from, right? And I'm going to be very, very direct. This lens could be a white identity type lens, heteronormative, gender binary norm. So it ends up then in an unspoken way holding up certain power structures. And that influences everything from recruitment, how people are promoted, and from a therapist point of view, having worked in EAP and having seen clients in the therapy room, some of this can cause pretty difficult psychological stuff for people. Microaggressions, open aggressions, race-based trauma. If you can imagine someone just constantly, just on a metaphorical level, getting kind of slapped a little bit. You shouldn't talk too loudly. Don't have that hairstyle. This communication style isn't accepted, right? These little things end up causing a deep amount of harm. And if you can imagine, an organization sits in a much larger system, right? Societal, whatever society is, whatever systemic oppression is happening on a larger societal scale, is, the organization is a microcosm of what's happening. And so all of these inequities get replicated or sort of are happening as well. And so when we think about culture fit, I often see that this particular systemic thing is happening. And so that for me is the harm that can happen from culture fit.
Yeah, talk about, a toxic culture leading to, or not even necessarily toxic culture, but culture fit leading to those unintended consequences. Great call out. Thank you so much, Cheryl.
Yeah, and Cheryl, you brought up a good point of how it affects the different processes in our organizations, right? Everything from hiring to promoting. So question for the group, how do hiring teams, managers, leaders move beyond thinking about a candidate for hire or promotion is a fit based on their biases or preconceived notions, and moving away from that to finding additions to the culture? Cheryl, why don't we start with
cool
let's go
question.
with you.
Yeah, no, go for it.
So we're talking about how to shift minds and those kinds of things. I think I'm going to just talk about the psychological. I think that we learn these things from a very young age. And we're talking about, some people call this unconscious bias, implicit bias. I like calling it subconscious bias because it's kind of conscious, but not quite conscious. But the reason it's kind of conscious but not is because we human beings learn about discrimination from the time we're babies, right? And we learn it on a muscular level, right? And so, for me, on a psychological level, becoming aware of these things that we've learned from our childhood and how we're carrying it in the workplace and how we are potentially perpetuating some of these harms with our coworkers, with the way we do appraisals, all these things, our working relationships. That's deep, deep, deep kind of emotional work and also relational, and sometimes it's reparative work. And so I think from the psychological perspective, for me, this is deeply personal. And then at the same time, relearning how we are in the workplace, bringing newer attitudes of like, these are deep values we're talking about. Can we start to value diversity, and what exactly does that mean? Can we make a commitment to working on a world that is more equitable? What does that mean? So these are deep, deep, personal values, and that become leadership values, and then it becomes organizational values. So that's sort of the mind shift that I sort of work with.
Yeah, that's a really good call out in having it stem not just back from, when we think we've learned these, but it really does go all the way back to our childhoods. And that just shows how deeply rooted all of these things are. And then they do become this second nature that we're not aware of. Vic, you were going to say something right before. So what did you have there?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Yeah. I think it's hard to be a recruiter, right? Because someone somewhere who has more power than you has decided they needed to fill a job. And usually they don't tell you, please take your time, relax, find the person slowly, but do it correct, right? In the proper, correct way. That's not usually the pressure you're under, is not like an accuracy pressure. It's usually a time crunch. We've got to hire these folks because something has happened and we've got to hire this human. We need a human now. So go get the humans now. And the easiest thing in the world to do if you're in that recruiting mindset is to look around at who is already in your workplace and to treat it as a template, right? We want to have templates for our work. It makes it a little bit easier. So how can we get the heck out of that? First of all, let's shift from looking at this sort of surface level template and start to examine what are the behaviors of the people who do this job really well, right? Like, let's look at our top performer. Hiring for sales, who's the top sales? Hiring for public policy, who's the most change-making public policy person? Hiring for engineering, who's your top engineers? Now, they might all be white dudes because this was all formed on one campus and one frat is where the startup came from, right? But they might not be behaving in their job role exactly the same if you switch from role to role. So try to figure out what is actually part of that, right? I had a great conversation with a recruiter who was innovating some new processes for finding sales leaders and said, hey, had a lead on a Ghirardelli chocolate salesperson. It was pretty dumb when we had a job advertisement that said must have 10 years experience in SaaS, software as a service sales, right? Turns out when they start to code, what do our top salespeople do? And then they open the job to people in sales who exhibited certain behaviors, people who could tell a story about how they exhibited these winning behaviors in that function, in that specific role, that it turns out that the person who sold chocolate could sell software too. Now, that person happened to be of non-white ethnicity, but people got to get over that. They got to start searching on the strategy, on the needs of their actual role, and kind of loosen up from this surface level homogeneity hiring that's going on so often. Yeah, if you look for 10 years of that experience, it's going to be the same dudes who are the dominant group in the software as a service market. You're just going to get the same.
Yeah, absolutely. Yvonne, what about you? What do you think?
No, I agree with what all my DEI colleagues have said. I think that Vic hits on a really great point, though, about looking at the skills of the individual talent. There are a lot of things that are transferable. And that was a perfect example of this individual. Yeah, he's selling chocolates, and that's not software as a service, certainly. But he had the skill set. And I think looking at those things, that's how we get beyond it. I also think that, doing what HR needs in terms of making resumes more agnostic, blinding that information, certainly that gives our indicators rather of race or what they think of certain demographics. Any information that talks about the individual and not so much the skill set they have, I think you block all that out and you get right down to the skills, and then you start looking at it and saying, okay, these are the skill sets that we need to advance, and this person has the skill sets, and that's it. And that's how I think you get, again, beyond that homogeneity, and you start to broaden out the search and the potential for candidates and bringing good talent into the door.
Yeah, no, I can't agree more, Yvonne. I'd love to see resumes and job descriptions start to be a lot more inclusive, with inclusive language, with looking at soft skills, and then also looking at military experience as it relates to the job too. I think that there's a big gap in terms of our veterans employees or veterans feeling that they can't apply for certain jobs because their skills don't translate to the job description or whatever it is they're putting out there.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, I dealt with it myself when I moved within industries, and I used to say, in interviews back when I was still in corporate, like, okay, this is a different product, this is a different service, but the tenets and the skills that are required to communicate about them and to market them, I have that. It's just a difference in terms of the product or the service. And so it was amazing to me how sometimes recruiters would kind of sit back and go, oh, yeah. And it's like
the aha moment.
Yeah, like they hadn't even considered that notion. So I think that's where we need to be headed in order to create more equity, certainly, of opportunities. So those veterans and so forth, you start looking at that job experience saying, okay, if we're just looking at the experience overall, how does that translate to what we're looking for? Okay, you have this, you have this, you have this. The employer take that out. That's I don't want to say irrelevant, but less relevant, certainly, than their ability to do the job based on the skills they bring to the table.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. Thank you, Yvonne. Thank you, Vic. Cheryl. So before we continue on to the next question, I want to ask the audience, if you have any questions, if there's any comments, anything for our panelists or for Chris and I, feel free to type it in. So in talking about culture fit versus culture add, how do you think that organizations can add to their culture without altering the culture?
It's going to be tough, yeah.
Yeah, that's a tough start. I think it's, looking at the organization's core values and possibly, figuring out and articulating how diversity and inclusion actually expands and amplifies those values. So you don't necessarily have to alter them to any great extent versus, looking at it through a different lens and really expanding on those definitions, expanding on those values and those mission statements in ways that make them more, diverse, inclusive, and equitable. That's how you add and build upon that, but also not to be afraid, I would think, to look at it and say, is it time for a culture transformation and a shift that needs to occur? And can we be open to that for not just the betterment of the organization, but also for the employees, this talent that you've hired and invested in and that you want to retain?
And I wonder, Yvonne, if you think part of this is almost the stage at which an organization is, right? Like adding one person to a 5-person firm, maybe and I'm just guessing here, probably doesn't change the culture all that much, right? I mean, sure, one person is, well, actually, maybe it matters if it's already a big firm. So adding one person to a gigantic firm, you're not going to see some massive shift in the culture. But if you're adding in these high growth firms, if you're adding 100 people a month for your high growth phase, how do you come out of that without there being some significant difference before your high growth phase, before you took the venture money, or before you happened to get a whole lot of orders, after a positive review of your product by some influencer, right? How can you not end up with a culture that's altered when you grow? Because the process of growing in and of itself, you're transforming into something that's different than your small, close-knit group, you and your auntie who invested in you and believed in your vision when everyone thought you were nuts, right? When it's you, your auntie, your frat brother, your god sister in a room building a business, that's going to be different than when you've professionalized and got real specialists with deep knowledge of a certain thing, of marketing or of engineering product or what have you. So I think it's important that people think of this as inevitable to some extent, and that leaders, the bosses, the people who want more money and more status, have to take it upon themselves to try to influence that process as you grow over time, to say, what can I do that demonstrates the kind of organization that I want this to be? How can I be so flagrantly fair out here that it serves as a powerful example of what I'm looking to do in this organization, right?
Vic, I love that. As you're saying that, what it triggered in me, in my brain, was that, startups, especially being here in Silicon Valley, right, is they all go through, as they go through that high growth stage, they have what we call the teenage years, right? Like,
Totally,
do we expect,
yeah.
and let's take that back to an actual human being going from a child through adolescence to becoming a young adult. Do you expect that person to be the same as they were as a child, as they were, as a young adult? No, you don't. So,
and we've got the expert here, Cheryl, on the developmental and the, things
exactly.
Going back to the roots. I mean, I've got a 7-year-old now. She's a lot different than in infancy, and I bet money she'll be very different at age 13, right?
Exactly. So it's unrealistic then, I think, to say that we as leaders in organizations, that we expect the organization to behave the exact same way as a culture before growth and after we've gone through that growth period, and even during that growth period. I do want to say thank you, Stephanie, who said to encourage culture add, it sounds like the existing organization needs to make space. So let's see if we can answer this question real quick. How do you encourage small-minded leadership to be expansive and make space? Cheryl, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is my small, if I had beef or tofu, this would be it.
I love it.
This is my thing. It's really hard when I see organizations that haven't really sort of examined the body of the organization, but they're bringing a whole bunch of diverse people in, whatever that means, right? Because they haven't made space yet. You've opened the door, but the culture hasn't totally opened up yet. And so you end up having a lot of problems. You have trouble with retention, for example, because people don't feel very welcomed, because the body of the organization hasn't had that transformation yet. I think when I work with leaders, I often talk about growth, and like we were talking earlier, there are, it's the 21st century. For example, if your cultural values, your mission statement, all of that was made in 1995, what needs to grow for the 21st century? Even when we look at countries with the Constitution, how we see the Constitution today is different from, I don't know, 100 years ago, 400 years ago, right? And so organizations are the same. You have values that you develop very early. They need to keep evolving. I would also suggest to leaders to take on an attitude of cultural humility when you're looking at these values. If you say that we value direct communication and transparency, that looks differently across cultures. So if you're going to bring in diversity, let's expand the notion of what this means and how this is going to happen, or how it's going to interact between cultures, and recognize that inequities exist. These, inequities and cross-cultural issues are going to happen when you start to bring in more diversity. And so I think, making space for that, for me, means sort of moving away from the cultural norm and sort of becoming culturally humble, that you are no longer the norm. It's a buffet. It's no longer a melting pot. So that's sort of the way I coach through these things.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I want to bring another question from the audience. So the next one we have is from Sarah Phelps. Hey, Sarah, by the way, thank you for joining us. The question we have is, how do you relieve the friction of a poorly articulated culture change goal with the addition of 100 people with 100 different experiences? So I will leave it to whoever would like to answer that.
It looks like Vic wants to answer that one.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. I talk a lot about startups. We can even think about this issue as not just an issue of adding 100 new people, right? But let's say net, right? But in, say, a slow changing organization, like a big government bureaucracy, my first career, State Department, it was there 100 years ago. It's the first cabinet agency. Is probably going to be there if the Republic survives another 100 years, right? Foreign policy will happen, right? There will be countries as far as I can see down the timeline. So the institution doesn't change that much. New country happens, you open up an embassy, you learn the language, you send some diplomats there, you work out your problems. There's a certain template to this over. Again, we can point to more than a century of history there, right? All the way back to Ben Franklin, right? So then the question is, what happens when the population is moving? The total number of folks doesn't change all that much. But some folks, the old slogan was you had to be male, pale, and Yale to be a U.S. diplomat. That was the standard, right? Some of these folks are going to age out. That's just the natural. People retire. They've earned that, right? Let's give them that. But just as the institution over time has faced societal pressure to, hey, why did you make this more fair? Couldn't we be missing out on some talent? There's some people who learn languages well who aren't white, presumably, right? As a matter of fact, you could even imagine that there's some folks with some more strategic languages under their belts in their own households that you might want to take advantage of to literally make diversity a powerful strategic advantage in your foreign policy, right? So, hey, we've got a diverse society. People know languages. People have code switching abilities. All these things probably give you an edge in the global geopolitical world, right? So you got to use that stuff, Congress says. So the State Department says, okay, we'll admit some of these new types, some of these people with different skin tones and stuff, if we must, right? So they do that. And then you have this question of being a manager of a much more diverse entry-level group at the low level is probably different. It's probably a tougher job. You probably have to do more interpretation today than you had to do in 1960s U.S. State Department and our foreign ministry, right? So when we have this question about like, how do you deal with culture change when there's new people, new types of humans or new varieties of humans in the mix, then you've got to have some amount of voluntariness, right? You've got to have some folks signed up to do interpretation work, which is part of the reason why a lot of the top-down mandatory cultural change initiatives are destined to fail. Mandatory D&I training is almost malpractice at this point. It's so bad. I mean, people just bar the door once they have a mandatory experience and block all the future diversity from coming in the organization. The backlash is out of control bad. You've got to think of ways to allow people to approach it as the hip thing, as the cool thing, as the ascendant thing, to be an open leader, to be a participative leader, to be the type who does the hard work of interpreting between one style and another. You've got to find some way to sign up. Now, the money to become a boss is always there. People want to be promoted because it's a better life to have status, or in the military for someone to salute you, for crying out loud. That's got to be pretty fun, right? Moving up the ranks has got to be cool. But you've got to make sure that you're finding in these voluntary encounters ways to sign up folks to do the hip new thing, which is to be the kind of open boss that can handle this diversity.
Yeah. So when we look at, that voluntary aspect of this, right, and really being voluntarily willing to change, there's always going to be that resistance from leadership. And I see Kyle W. typed in this question, what type of metrics, if any, would you suggest organizations use to measure success of a culture ad initiative to hold leaders accountable, right? So when we look at that voluntariness, you also have that pushback from leadership who is constantly pushing for that, right? What is the ROI? How do we measure this thing? Yvonne, I know you have quite a bit of experience from a corporate perspective. What do you think about that? How would you measure these initiatives?
So one thing that an organization can definitely look at is, the employee survey tools that they have at their disposal to kind of measure, engage, take a temperature on the workforce to say, our employees, are we meeting the needs of our employees? Are they satisfied? And look at some of those. You can bring in, if you don't already have in-house diversity, equity, and inclusion consultants like myself, like Cheryl, like John, like several of us, to come in and do some cultural assessments and kind of look at the organization to get a little bit deeper. And then, I think also, I'm just looking here at Kyle's question again, to hold leaders accountable, there's a lot of tools you can do. A lot of organizations are now adding accountability measures to their annual goals to say, listen, you've got to take the reins on this. You really need to be doing something. And it's a bit of a carrot and sticks approach, but it's something that tends to work. It's more forced. It's not that voluntary, aspect that Vic mentioned that I think is really important, but it does get them at least in the mind frame of looking at it and saying, okay, Mr. Manager, you have a completely white team. You need to be looking and diversify. We're going to bring you some candidates. We're going to be looking at pipeline opportunities to start putting people in your midst. And you have a responsibility to be looking at this talent and to consider adding them to your team or even mixing up teams. And this has been really interesting. I read an article recently that talked about that they were taking two teams that were pretty homogeneous and actually looking at the skill sets and saying, okay, this team is pretty diverse. This team is not. Can we skill swap and bring this person over here and take this other person there? And I thought, wow, that's the type of innovative thinking that we need to also retain a talent that you have in an organization and help them to feel appreciated and then expose them to other opportunities. So I think that those are a couple of different ways. I hope I answered your question, Kyle, about those are the type of metrics that you can get and you can kind of look at to see where things are at, and then hold the organization, hold the team accountable for meeting certain standards and goals. And not just in lip service, but in real measurable numbers, and to take accountability for getting them where they belong.
I love that, Yvonne, because I think that accountability piece is so important, and so many organizations and leaders miss out on that. And it's absolutely vital to the success of the program. So in consciousness of time, I'm going to ask one final question of each of you. So, one of the toughest things to evolve to having a culture ad organization is that this is truly a long-term change. We all know it's not going to happen overnight. So what are the things that really need to happen in order to get us there?
Well, some change is slow, and then sometimes there's shocks. Just weird stuff happens, right? You're in a government agency that just doesn't change very much, and then there's a terrorist attack on your flagship city, right? That can force a lot of weird things. Imagine being Robert Mueller. He's famous for other things these days, but imagine you're leading the FBI at the exact moment, you can time it, September 11th, 2001, it stopped being sort of police. Hey, a thing already happened. Let's go investigate it and prosecute someone. And started being a national security organization. Like, hey, maybe we should think about bad things before they happen. Now that's a big culture shift from like a bunch of prosecutors who are like, oh yeah, did this happen and who did it, to like some prevention type thinkers who are like, I need to predict what's gonna happen here and what are the risks, and I need to forecast risks and all this other weird stuff. So all of a sudden, the Justice Department, this legalistic thing, had to think in these weird, it was weird for them, national security kinds of ways, was a weird thing. Companies face this a lot, right? Have you ever been in a market that shifted because someone else innovated, right? Like someone in some other organization did something innovative. Whoa, crap, this thing won't work. Strategy A is out the window. So sometimes it's slow. Like my experience is sort of a newer Black officer in a very different kind, a non-Black U.S. Department of State, it's fair to say, right? That was a slower change, right? Bringing in diversity. So, these things can come in many directions, but I think the important thing is that people with different ideas and different skills get together and try to figure out what's happening in this weird new need that they have, right? In this new environment they're in, when they know that culture change is sometimes a matter of actual survival. This company may fail if we don't change how we approach everything. What we take is an assumption. What ways we do business will have to be totally different. Our culture has to be totally different, or else we just won't survive. Yeah. Or if you're in a place that doesn't change very often, maybe it's that the culture has to change because, by gosh, our society demands some more democracy, demands that we see people for their whole richness of skills instead of doing the old homogeneity hire and bringing in another mic from your university, right? So sometimes it's because society demands it, and you have to figure it out. You have to work with folks who've got multiple skills to figure out, hey, how can we do differently here? So get a team together, get a task force together, that somebody with this lens and that skill and this race, yes, also select on diverse race and gender identity, right? And a whole host of things like physical abilities, right? Try to get people who've got a bunch of different lenses who match the complexity of the real environment. Because, there's not just one type of person out there that you're interfacing with outside the organization.
Yeah, I think that was such a good call out of, just making sure that you have all different kinds of people. Yvonne, what's your take?
I appreciate a lot of Vic's perspective on that. And I do think that, embedding diversity, equity, inclusion as part of your organization, not this thing off to the side, not this thing that, well, if we have budget, we'll allocate a few dollars to this or a few dollars to that. It should be, a line item in your annual budget is, whether that's contributing to employee resource groups and business resource groups and properly funding those efforts, if it's putting in a DEI position and in-house and then building that framework out, as Vic mentioned, getting a DEI council and look at all diversity as a spectrum and make sure that you have representation there. So I think that that's something really important, and to understand that it's a marathon and it's not a sprint. And also that DEI is not, it's a journey. There's no destination. It's not if we do these things and now we are diverse, equitable, and inclusive. It's an ongoing journey. And so you have to be committed to doing the work over the long term, because as society shifts, so will the issues that, impact diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. So, but I don't want to eat up all the time. I'd love to hear what Cheryl has to say.
It is a long journey, and it's a journey, right? There's no final woke point. There's no final woke destination, right? We are constantly awakening. I'm a conscious leadership coach, so I constantly talk about this, that we're just constantly awakening to everything happening around us. I think that it is a long journey, but I think there are some urgent things that need to happen right now, because the truth is harms are getting perpetuated. And I think that the absence to these harms are what plagues us, not just in organizations, but as a larger society and as people living on the planet right now. And we kind of already see that even sort of the climate change issues are highly related to DEI issues. They're sort of the same thing. And we are in the 21st century. So if we are holding on to perspectives and values that were in the 20th century, and we're not seeing that these are actually really detrimental to your business. If you have a product with a model with a face like mine, and you put Zen on the top of that thing, and you're trying to sell that product and you're getting complaints, I'm sorry, it's not working in the 21st century. You're not going to get your customers after some time. If people know that you're, investing in ways that are not DEI conscious, it's going to be out in the open. If employees are going into your organizations and having a really hard time because they're Black, Indigenous, people of color, because they're queer, it's going to be out in the open at some point. It's the era of social media. It's not 1985 anymore. Stuff like that, as it's going to be let out of the bag. So yes, it is a long journey. I think people need really strong metrics. We need to, one of the biggest things for me is measuring psychological safety in the context of diversity. If you can start measuring that, you can actually measure success. And having very clear standards for managers to meet, having really great training, lots of leadership coaching to help trainers get there. To help managers get there. People don't quit jobs, they quit managers, right? So your managers may not have or may not understand what it means to have cultural humility or cultural competence or what it means to be an ally to, LGBTQIA+. They just need the training and they need clear standards. And we just need to keep driving these things in, stay with your values, keep expanding your values, and be human, right? Have a culture of being human, and being human means you're on this planet, so you're connected to plants and animals, so anyway, I getting off the soapbox, but thank you.
No, I love it. Absolutely love it. I love all of your thoughts. Thank you again so much for coming on. Real quick before we sign off, one final sentence from each of you on this topic, either something you maybe learn from one another or maybe a quick sentence on what you want people to know. And for those of you who are in the audience, please tell us, what is your one sentence that you took away from this session? Vic, take it away. What is your one last sentence that you want to leave with everyone? Vic, it looks like you are looks like you're muted.
Oh,
there you go. Yep.
Testing. All right, we're back.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. You'd think that would have given me a chance to think of the perfect thing, but I think I really want people to think of diversity work and changing your culture and fitting in new people, right? As boss work, as leader work. Like, this is your purpose, right? Getting a whole amalgamation of Super Friends or Planeteers or Marvel Cinematic Universe types to congeal in a single kind of direction, in a direction that benefits whatever the heck you're pursuing, whether it's Health and Human Services Department, you know what you're after in Health and Human Services, or if it's in a brand new platform social media company, right? You know what you're pursuing. You know you're going to need more than one kind of brain to get there. And you've got to admit that it's awfully suspicious if all of your supposedly extremely different brains have the same racial and gender packaging. That's a little weird, y'all. Like, let's be a little suspicious of homogeneity hiring. It means you're not looking for skills. You're looking to be warm and comfortable. But boss work means getting in there and managing any frictions that are going to come up. Managing through that to reach your ultimate goal. Yeah.
Fantastic. Hashtag boss work right there. Yvonne, what is your last final sentence for the audience?
We are all on this planet and thus part of a community. So let's get to work on supporting that.
Awesome. Thank you. And Cheryl, how about you?
My last sentence: diversity is the most natural damn thing. No snowflake looks alike. No leaf is the same. Inequities bastardize that. And if you want diversity, you've got to have conflict management skills. And so that's at the end.
Awesome. And I see, Kyle W saying culture ad is an all you can eat buffet. So Cheryl, there you go. You've definitely created that. And from me, I will say what I usually say, right, is that this is not a moment. This is a movement. Get on the movement, right? As Yvonne said, this is a marathon. As Cheryl said, it's a journey. As Vic said, it can go fast. It can go slow. You don't know. It's going to get moving. John, any final last thoughts before we sign off?
No, I just want to thank you all for being here, being a part of this. Thank you to those who watched it live, who will watch it in the future. I just am so grateful.
Well, fantastic. Again, thank you all for joining us. For those of you who are watching this after the fact, not a problem. Just reach out to any of us. We are happy to continue the conversation. For those of you who are in the audience, again, thank you so much. Have a great night, great afternoon, great morning, wherever you are in the world. And we are so glad you joined us. Have a good one.